want to talk about what happens inside the ventricle and the aorta as contraction occurs. So we're going to start with the ventricle. Stepping over to here. So we are going to draw a little line. We're going to come up and go down, and we'll pause right there. So this chart up here that we're talking about has to do with the pressure of contraction inside the left ventricle. So the first thing that happens is we have something called, isovolumetric contraction. I'm just gonna write isovolumetric for that. And what's happening is the heart is actually starting to squeeze the blood, but no valve is open yet. So we just see a ginormous spike in pressure. Right at the peak of our pressure here, the aortic valve opens. So we call this emptying. And then once the aorta has been emptied, we go into isovolumetric relaxation. And then as we continue on here, our pressure more or less doesn't really change until we start another contraction over here. But there are two more phases, as you can see by the red lines. The first red line is what we call diastasis. Diastasis is the natural filling of the ventricle with blood from the aorta. So the vast majority of the pressure, or the vast majority of the blood that comes from the atria down to either the ventricles, and in this case the left ventricle, is passive, meaning gravity just naturally pulls that down. And that's going to remain true until we hit this little bump right here, which is going to be aortic systole. Now we'll dive into more a bit later, but aortic systole just means the period of contraction. So our aorta is actually contracting and it's just topping off our blood. If I were to take this and talk about blood volume on the bottom part of our chart here, it would look something like this. Now to talk about the volume down on this part. What we're going to see is that our volume is going to be high until we get into line with the emptying. That's going to cause a huge drop in our volume. And that volume is going to remain low until we hit diastasis, come down to here, and then it's going to begin passively filling until we hit the aortic systole, which we see kind of a sharp increase in volume all of a sudden because aortic systole is just topping up the heart. I didn't draw this very accurately, but the vast majority of the blood volume is actually just coming from diastasis, and then the aortic systole just tops the blood off inside the heart. And then last but not least, our favorite valve in the heart, the aorta. So the aorta is going to be sitting right around 100 millimeters mercury to begin with, and it's going to remain like that. So this is actually where it's closed, but all of a sudden pressure is enough where we can begin opening the aorta and moving volume from our left ventricle into the aorta, and then it's going to actually remain above where it was, and it's slowly going to bleed off until we get to the next spot. And that's just because as blood continues to move out through the body, going through circulation, we just have less back pressure against the valve itself. Something I wasn't able to accurately draw here, but I think is important to note, is the dicrotic notch. So the dicrotic notch, if I had to come back and fix it, would look something like this. It's just a little swoop inside our natural pressure. And what we're actually witnessing here is that as the aorta closes, let's say this is my aortic door over here, and this is my ventricle, this is my valve, and then this is the aorta. So when the ventricle is open, blood's just coming in all happy, but all of a sudden I cut that off, and what we see is a spike in pressure. So we go doop, we droop down, and then we see a spike in pressure because all of a sudden this tube is going to be pressurized, which means we get a bounce back, sort of a reverberation of pressure throughout our aorta, which is going to make that's what causes this little hoop-de-doo to occur, that dichrotic notch. All right, now I want to talk about something called pressure volume curves. So this is volume, and this is pressure. So in pressure volume curves, we see a general shape that looks like this. Yeah, I messed that up a little bit, but you get the idea. So this is all in respect to the ventricle itself. So what we see here is the gradual increase of volume, and this is during the diastasis period, where we're increasing our volume, diastasis, and also our aortic systole. But our volume increases, and then all of a sudden, from here, let me make this more of a clear line, right there. From here to here is our isovolumetric contraction. And then all of a sudden we see some ejection because we're having a net movement down our volume, but our pressure is going to keep going up as we open up the aortic valve. So this is ejection. And then as we decrease, this is our contraction, and this on our side is our isovolumetric relaxation. And then this is generally this is the sort of the picture perfect pressure volume loop, and we fill up the ventricle, isovolumetric, eject, relax, fill up, eject, or fill up, contract, eject, relax, and it just goes over and over and over again. Now, there are a couple of factors that we can talk about as far as these pressure volumes. In terms of our pressure volume loop, there's three definitions I want to give that we are going to be changing here in a second. So the first is inotropy. Inotropy. This equals the strength of our contraction. We could also say intensity of our contraction. We have a term called afterload, which is how hard is it to move blood, how hard it is to move blood. And then we have preload, which is equal to our venous return. So, let me draw a new chart over here with a new pressure volume graph. So this line right here represents ionotropy. And if this is volume and that's pressure, we can see that ionotropy measures change as a function of pressure and volume. So the steeper this line is, the more pressure is required to move a small amount of volume, or a smaller amount of volume of blood. The stroke volume here, so we have another term in here, which is our stroke volume. And I want to show you what it looks like if we change things like afterload and preload specifically. So if we change preload, notice let's call this 80 milliliters of blood. That's in the range of what an average human's going to move per stroke of the heart. So if I were to change this and make it make our width smaller, but make our height taller, that would cause our ionotropy arrow to move. Notice now it's requiring more pressure. It's requiring more pressure per unit of volume that we're moving. This happens when our heart muscles become too tight, or we have a lot of high pressure. I mean, we're experiencing a lot of resistance. That's causing our stroke volume to go from, like, say, 80 milliliters to, I don't know, I'm just making up numbers here, 60 milliliters. Inversely, drawing a new chart for clarity. If I did increase what's called my preload, meaning I'm able to move more blood per unit of force, then I'm going to have a higher venous output or higher stroke volume. So this is ultimately causing me to have less struggle with my heart. And just as a rule of thumb, or to explain preload a little bit more, as we the reason why we're able to increase cardiac output, or rather stroke volume, as we pump or as we have a higher venous return, is because as we stretch cardiomyocytes inside the cell, we're actually getting a higher exposure of actin to myosin heads, and it just is stronger. Yeah.